Well, first we're going to get the D6 attached to the frame. This is going to get attached to the Trommel, and the 220's excavator is going to get attached to Trommel. Tony Beets found a rusted TRL abandoned in the Yukon wilderness, filled with gold, and no one saw it coming. After losing nearly $1 million and watching his prized dredge, the Viking, burst into flames, Tony was running out of options. With everything on the line, he gambled on a 30-year-old machine left to rot in the wild. It was a risk that could either save his mining operation or bury it for good. Let us follow Tony's journey as he fights against time with winter closing in and discover if this forgotten relic can change everything. Rust, relics, and risks, just over $400,000 for a Trommel that hadn't run in years. And if that wasn't already a gamble, it was abandoned deep in the Yukon. But the gold prospector had run out of choices and had big plans for that forgotten hunk of metal. His entire operation now depended on resurrecting that rusted beast. His big dream, the Viking dredge, had been a colossal part of his operation, combing through the Klondike rivers and filtering gold out of mountains of dirt. But as fate would have it, even the best machines break down. One day, the Viking burst into flames and threw a major wrench in his plans. While no one was hurt, the miner was staring at a huge loss. That dredge was no small investment. Repairing it wasn't just about slapping on a few new parts, the damage was extensive and it cost a pretty penny. After that disaster, the miner had to put the Viking aside. He shifted his focus to an older dredge number 1, but that thing wasn't much better. Constant repairs, replacing parts, and sinking more money into it didn't help his cause. The dredge could pull in tons of material, but the operation needed more. He needed a reliable machine that would help him strike gold, literally. And then it happened, another failure. One of the dredges sank, not once, but twice in just a few weeks. The situation looked bleak, and it seemed like every plan the miner had was doomed to fail. The same dredge had a legacy of success back in the day, pulling out 1 million ounces of gold in the late 1930s, but its glory days were long gone. Now it was clogging, leaking, and sinking like a brick. The prospector needed a miracle, and he found it in the shape of an abandoned mobile TRL rusting away in the Yukon wilderness. The TRL was a huge piece of equipment, 35 tons of metal, wheels, and promise. It was built by a lone miner about 30 years ago, used for just a single season, and then left to rot. The veteran saw potential in it. With gold prices climbing and his dredges falling apart, he decided to spend the money, around $400,000, to bring the TRL back to life. Unlike his stationary dredges, this TRL was mobile, meaning it could move from site to site, and it was his new golden hope. Getting the machine was the easy part, the real challenge was getting it out of the wilderness and back to camp. The Trommel was in Moose Creek and his crew had to haul it more than 100 miles over rough mountain roads. His youngest son, Mike, led the crew, and the journey wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. The machine had to be loaded onto a ferry, but Mike worried if the truck's length, over 80 feet, was too much for the ferry to handle. If they couldn't get it across, they'd have to go the long way, almost 200 miles around, to the nearest bridge. The Trommel was massive, so they had to break it down piece by piece to move it. First, they removed the conveyor, then the sluice box, and finally the heavy 20-ton drum. Each day was a struggle, equipment failures, dangerous situations, and exhaustion. There was one close call where the TRL nearly tipped over, almost crushing one of the crew members. It wasn't just about the work, the stress was a constant factor, and everyone knew that one wrong move could mean disaster. Despite the challenges, they managed to get the TRL out of the wilderness. They loaded it onto a military-grade transporter and began the long drive back to camp. It wasn't smooth sailing, rough roads, thick mud, and unpredictable weather made the journey a nerve-wracking experience. More than once, the truck leaned precariously to one side, its wheels lifting off the ground. It was only through sheer luck and skill that they kept it from tipping over completely. Back at camp, the miner gathered his crew to thank them for their hard work. They had pulled off something remarkable, and even though they hadn't found any gold during those 3 days, he knew the real value of that Trommel was in what it could do for them in the future. He was betting big on this machine to bring his operation back to life and avoid the downtime that had plagued him since the Viking went down. The TRL wasn't just another piece of equipment, it was a game changer. Unlike the old dredges, this machine was efficient, mobile, and perfect for the kind of mining needed. Once it was running, it could process huge amounts of material quickly, and that meant more gold in less time. The prospector knew this was his best shot at turning things around, and he wasn't going to waste it. But the road to success is never easy, especially not in gold mining. His big plans for the Trommel were about more than just striking it rich, it was about long-term stability. He wanted to build a reliable operation that could handle the challenges of the Yukon, and the Trommel was a big part of that vision. By focusing all his resources on getting it set up, he was making a strategic move that he hoped would pay off in a big way. Of course, his rough-and-tumble approach to mining hasn't always earned him fans. His no-nonsense attitude and harsh leadership style have been controversial, to say the least. One infamous incident where someone from his crew poured gasoline into a dredge pond and set it on fire led to serious legal trouble. What might have been a joke turned into a major problem when it was broadcast on television, catching the attention of authorities. He faced fines, and the incident added to his already tough reputation. With the Trommel back in action, Tony now faces the challenge of getting it running smoothly before winter hits. Building a golden legacy, Tony isn't just a tough guy, he's also a smart businessman. He's always willing to take risks, and he knows that to succeed in the gold mining world, you have to be willing to bet big. His investments in new equipment like the TRL and a custom-built excavator show his commitment to staying ahead of the game. He's not just looking for short-term gains, he's building something that will last, even if it means taking on huge challenges along the way. The miner's journey with the Trommel was not without its share of setbacks. When they finally managed to get it back to camp, it wasn't just about putting it back together, it was about making sure every bolt, every joint, and every mechanical component worked perfectly. The TRL had been sitting in the wilderness for decades, and there was no telling how many parts needed replacing. The prospector brought in his most skilled mechanics to go over every inch of it, inspecting and testing. They replaced worn-out belts, rusted gears, and even upgraded parts that could improve efficiency. It was a tedious process that took weeks, but the mining veteran knew that rushing it would only lead to more problems down the line. While the Trommel was being rebuilt, the gold digger couldn't just sit around and wait. He had other parts of his mining operation that needed attention. The dredges were still causing problems, and with winter fast approaching, he had to make some tough decisions. He decided to mothball dredge number 1 temporarily. There was simply no point in pouring more money into it when it was barely pulling in any gold. Instead, he redirected his crew to focus on setting up the TRL and preparing for the next mining season. The Yukon winter is no joke, temperatures drop well below freezing, and the ground becomes rock solid, making any kind of mining nearly impossible. The leader knew that if they didn't get the TRL up and running before the first heavy snowfall, they would lose precious time and potentially miss out on a whole season of mining. The pressure was on, and everyone in the camp could feel it. The days were long, and the nights were even longer, filled with the sound of grinding metal and the glow of welding torches as the crew worked around the clock. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Trommel was ready. It was a beast of a machine, towering over the camp, its massive drum gleaming under the pale Yukon sun. The boss gathered the crew for the moment of truth, the first test run. The atmosphere was tense, everyone knew what was at stake. If the Trommel failed, it would be a devastating blow, not just to the operation's finances but to the crew's morale as well. With a nod from the foreman, the operator fired up the engine. The TRL roared to life, the drum beginning to turn slowly at first, then picking up speed. The conveyor belts rattled, and the sluice box clanged as the first load of dirt was fed into the machine. Everyone held their breath as the Trommel did its work, separating the dirt from the gold. It was a tense few minutes, but then there it was, a glint of gold in the sluice box. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The crew erupted in cheers, and the seasoned miner allowed himself a rare smile. The Trommel worked, and it was going to change everything. With the TRL operational, the trailblazer wasted no time putting it to work. The crew moved it to one of the most promising spots on the claim, an area that had shown signs of rich gold deposits in the past but was too difficult to reach with the old dredges. The Trommel's mobility made it perfect for the job. The first few weeks were tough as the crew got used to the new machine, but they quickly got into a rhythm. The TRL proved to be a game-changer. It was faster, more efficient, and easier to maintain than the old dredges. It could process tons of material in a fraction of the time, and it was pulling in gold at an impressive rate. As the weeks turned into months, the miners' gamble started to pay off. The Trommel wasn't just covering its costs, it was turning a profit. The crew's spirits were high, and the veteran felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. He knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, things were looking up. Looking back on the journey, it was clear that the Trommel had been worth the risk. The miner's decision to invest in the abandoned machine had saved his operation from the brink of disaster. It had given him a new lease on life and a fighting chance to continue his dream of striking it rich in the Yukon. And as the first snows of winter began to fall, the trailblazer stood by the Trommel, watching it work, and thinking about the future. He knew there would be more challenges, more risks to take, but for now, he was content. The Trommel had become more than just a piece of equipment, it was a symbol of perseverance, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of a dream.